Good evening. I'm Joyce Reese McCullum. I'm going to do a presentation for you tonight on researching African-American ancestry. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I've been researching as a genealogist since 1985, when I learned that both of my maternal great-grandfathers had been Civil War veterans. I am a professional genealogist. Probably one of the highlights of my career with the 7th great-granddaughter of a documented slave girl who was brought to Charleston in 1756. Not many of us have the opportunity to trace back to that village in Africa, but we can find out a great deal about our ancestors. I'm going to present to you some of the methods and some research sites, and the majority of them I've tried to gear for home researching. To begin your research, you always want to start with what you know. You think about your parents and their great-grandparents, because these are the people we're going to be looking for. So what you want to do, of course, is have a pedigree chart. I've listed some sites where you can get free pedigree charts and other forms that you can use. You want to talk with your elders, talk to the older relatives, interview them, and make notes. You're going to find that a lot of times the things that they tell you, they might not be pertinent at that particular time, but maybe years later you'll come back and say, oh, Aunt Grace said so-and-so, and you'll verify it and it'll be correct. You want to collect family memorabilia. I always say, go look in that old hat box. You know, the one with the family papers, all the old graduation announcements and wedding invitations and birth announcements. These things are very relevant to our research. Cindy's List is a good site for free forms. You can get blank census forms. You can get pedigree charts. You can get the wheel charts if that's what you prefer, and they're all downloadable for you. This is one of the fancier, cute little charts. And basically, this is how our research begins. You start with yourself, your parents, their parents, and you go as far back as you can go. You start out with the bare bones, and as you do your research, you add flesh and life and character to these individuals. Africans arrived in this country before the Mayflower. The first documented Africans were on a Portuguese ship that landed, and they exchanged the slaves for supplies for the ship. They were not enslaved, though. They became indentured servants. And supposedly the first documented child born in this country was the child of one of these Africans. This is a chart of the Atlantic slave trade and the route that the ships took. We talk about the triangular slave route. They would leave the coast of West Africa with slaves, take them to the New World. Those that were coming here, very often they would take them to the West Indies to be seasoned, which means to be broken in. From the West Indies, many of them ended up in Charleston, South Carolina, which up until the 1830s, Charleston was for Africans what Ellis Island was for immigrants coming from Europe. The majority of the slaves landed there, and a vast majority of them came from the west coast of Africa, which was almost identical geographically and climatically. This is the rice coast of Africa. The slaves from there were very prized to go to the rice coast of Charleston, South Carolina, some parts of North Carolina, Georgia, and a little bit of Florida. Between 1650 and 1860, approximately 10 to 15 million enslaved people were transported from Western Africa to the Americas. Most were shipped to the West Indies, Central America, and South America. Now that number, the 10 to 15 million, those are the ones that they know arrived. And you can probably estimate that maybe half that many didn't make the passage for whatever reason, sickness, disease on the ship. If there was a threat of the ship being captured, very often they would throw the Africans overboard. Researching online, there's a huge amount of information that you can sit right in your own desk at your own computer and get. These are some of the most popular sites. My favorite sites for African American research would be Afrogenius.com. We refer to this as the mothership. It was the first website dedicated to African American research, and it's still probably the best. Africana Heritage is a site that I was the co-administrator on for 8 years, and of course I think that's a pretty good site too. Low Country Africana deals specifically with people whose ancestry begins in South Carolina. As I said, the vast majority of Africans came through Charleston and were bought and sold there. And there are a lot of records. On fold3.com, there is a section that covers all of the wills and inventories of slave owners in the state of South Carolina. The beautiful thing about this is that we indexed something like 40,000 documents. Each will, each name is indexed, from the name of the slave owner to the name of each slave, to the lawyers, to the witnesses, to anyone that that slave owner might have owed or been owed money by. It's a great resource. Ancestry.com. I think all of us have seen their commercials on TV. It is a good site. It is also a subscription site. But at the libraries, your local libraries, you can access Ancestry.com, Heritage Quest, FamilySearch.com for free. RootsWeb.com. I really like RootsWeb. They are in partnership with Ancestry, but they have broken down their records by state. Excuse me. They have a wonderful mailing list. They have forums, and you can exchange information through them. They also, most of the sites, if you go to them, put in African American, and records specific to African Americans will come up. Let's see. Afrogenius.com not only has forums, it's broken down. They have old photographs. They have documents that people have sent in. They have a chat line. They do broadcasts. Mailing lists. African Native American Heritage, you can look at there. Caribbean Research, DNA, Free Persons of Color, Slave Research, and it goes on and on. The resources, you can submit stories, census records, death records database, library records, marriage, slave data collection. You can do a lot at this one site. ritzweb.com, as I mentioned before, Heritage Quest, and my new favorite is macavo.com. Someone give me a name and county and a state. Okay, let's open the site and I'll show you what you can find there. What's the name? Last name? Married name. And we're going to search. We came up with nothing. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. Just to show you, I'm going to put in Lamar County, Alabama. Thank you. And here's what you come up with. Precinct 1 is Vernon, which is kind of like the county seat. That's where the county courthouse is. You have ancestry boards where people are sharing information. There's some for Lamar County, Texas, too. I suggest that all of you, when you're looking for something, go to Google, put in the area that you want. Put in African-American genealogy, Yuma County, Arizona. It'll give you, if there is a genealogy society, it'll come up. If there are records available, it'll come up. It will tell you what they have at their courthouse and give you a drop-down menu of what you can get there. Always Google first. And once again, Cindy's list. And Cindy has huge lists of sites that can be checked out, not just for African Americans. We want to find our ancestors on the 1870 census. This was the first census that African Americans appeared on as citizens. This was after the Civil War, after they were emancipated. Free people of color have been enumerated since the very first census in 1790. They only list the surnames, and they're listed by state. The 1870 and the 1860 census, it's crucial if you can find and locate the last slave owner, because his records, you see, prior to 1870, we're doing slave genealogy. The paper trail will be in the owner's papers. That can be his plantation records, journals, bills of sale, mortgages, wills. Sometimes they actually took out mortgages on slaves and they had liens against them. Very often they would hire out a skilled slave if he had a trade. If it was not the growing season and they lived near the river, they may rent them out to work on the riverboats as dockmen. So the importance of the 1860, it will show the last slave owner. You can find slave schedule census records, 1840, 1850, 1860. These records show the slave owner, the number of slaves that he owns, which will be broken down by gender and age, no names. If he's a large slaveholder, it's very difficult to connect. My own personal experience, I was able to match the ages and the years of birth to my relatives when they were enslaved. You want to look for land records. Many blacks did acquire land after the Civil War. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't the 40 acres and the mule. That was a field order that was issued by General Sherman in South Carolina. It was never voted upon by Congress, and it never was enacted other than on those particular plantations in South Carolina. So, nope, no 40 acres or mule. We want to look at Freedmen Bureau records. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up after the Civil War because basically what you had was 4 million homeless, uneducated, unemployed people. The Freedmen's Bureau set up schools, hospitals. They worked with orphans. They transported people. They helped people locate family members if they could. They performed marriages. And they also set up the Freedmen's Bank, which was the Enron scandal of its time. It failed miserably, but they had wonderful records of the freedmen that were depositors. Also on the marriage records, they asked questions like, were you involved in a prior relationship? How did it end? And very often they'll say, through slavery. Did you have children by that relationship? Are they still living? So you get family group information. Sometimes you'll see ads and newspaper articles for people trying to locate lost relatives. And prior to emancipation, many times there would be ads looking for runaway slaves, offering a reward. I encourage you to locate the local genealogy societies. If you're researching in Choctaw County, Mississippi, find out if they have an African-American or any genealogy society or historical society. Make contact with them. Get some boots on the ground. Very often a phone call and you chat them up a little bit and they'll be glad to go and find something for you. A lot of the county courthouses, they may have a nominal fee for records, for a marriage license or a death certificate, something of that nature. Step out there. Be aggressive with your research, but be pleasant. Use the interlibrary loans. If you locate any books that were written on your area of research, see if you can get a copy. Interlibrary loan, sometimes they might charge you the postage to send it. My own personal experience, for Lamar County, Alabama, we found a copy of the book, but it was in Lamar County, Texas. They wouldn't send the book, but they were kind enough to send me copies of the index. I looked in the index, and there was my great-great-grandfather and several other relatives that I recognized. So I was lucky enough that a friend in Alabama got the book and made copies of that particular chapter for me. And there were articles about my relatives. I suggest that if you're just starting out, read a couple of books on doing African American research. My two favorites are Finding a Place Called Home by D. Palmer Woodtor, and she was a mentor to me when I started out. And Tony Burroughs, who is probably, next to Lewis Gates, our most well-known African-American genealogist at this time. Like I said, seek out the genealogy libraries and groups in your research area. Use your Google. Use Macavo and Zillow. You can use Zillow or Google Earth. Our little family church down in Alabama, we Googled in on it, and there was the church, and there was the road, and I was telling Larry, oh yeah, that's where Aunt Krantz had her cornfield. So you can actually see these places. Starting your search. And once again, this is what we're going to be looking for. We want census records, marriage, birth, and death, vital records, military records, land records, church and cemetery records. Very often, the little small towns that our families came from, the only thing that might be left is the church and the cemetery. And you want to go and see if your relatives, if you can find them on the tombstones. And if you're down south, be sure to make sure that you're chigger-proof, because they will eat you up going through the weeds. A girlfriend of mine, she actually goes out and she records cemeteries in Alabama, and she emailed me, and she had been out with a couple, and she was taking them to show them the cemetery, and she said she stepped off into a grave up to her knee. And had they have not been there, she would not have been able to get out, and she didn't have her cell phone with her. So her message read, 1 foot in the grave, but I'm still kicking. You want to look through newspaper records. Older newspapers are usually archived. It may require you going, like here, we go to the State Capitol Library down on 17th Avenue in Washington at the State Capitol, where they have all of the older Arizona newspapers. And they're tough to read and go through them, but sometimes it's really worth it if you do. We talked about locating the last slave owner. The majority of the freed slaves did not take on the name of the last slave owner. And I look at it like this. Freedom wasn't a certainty right after the war. Everything was chaos. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And I'm sure that a lot of people were thinking, well, what if they decide to change their minds and we become slaves again? I don't want old Mr. Molyneux to know where I'm at. I'm going to be whoever. Or maybe your parents belong to someone else. And you say, well, I'm going to take the name of my father. In my own situation, my great-grandparents, although they had been together from 1858, some of their children were born as early as 1862, but they all went in his surname rather than in the last name of the owner. And I think that many African mothers probably told their children, well, yeah, you know, we belong to Mr. Jones, but you are Smith, because that's your daddy's name. And when you're trying to find people, names are so important. You might want to go to the Library of Congress online and look at the slave narratives. What they did during the Depression, they had WPA workers go out and interview former slaves. And there's hundreds of them. Some of them even have pictures. And some of them have histories that are just unbelievable for the community and other slaves and things that were going on at that time. It's well worth looking at. You just go to the Library of Congress, and on the search area, actually I think it's www.loc. And you go to the search and put in slaves, and a drop-down menu with all sorts of information will come up for you. After the Civil War, in some of the southern states, in 1866, they took a special census of the newly freed Africans. Some states still have this, and they are available. Usually it'll be county by county, not for the entire state. Okay, when you're looking at the census records, you want to find out if there are other family members living close by. The reason being If you're looking on, and we'll take it up a notch, we'll say if you're looking on the 1900 census and your family's there, and then you go to the 1910 and you can't find them, and you say, well, I know that they were in this place at that time, and they were living next door to the Joneses. Go and see if you can find the Joneses. People tended to live in cluster groups for safety, for comfort. If we all belong to one family group and we're going to settle somewhere, we're going to settle together. Many of the freedmen did relocate. Some of them went back east to try to find their families. Some of them became part of the exoduster movement. Pap Singleton got together wagon trains and took African Americans to the free states and to the Indian Territory, Nebraska, Kansas. Along the way, they created some all-black towns that are still in existence. Some of you may have heard of Boley, Oklahoma. It's still there. In California, one of the Buffalo Soldiers, Colonel Allen, he was in charge of the Buffalo Soldiers who were working at the Yellowstone Park there. They did the infrastructure, the highway system, the drainage canals, and he created an all-black town called Allensworth for the Buffalo Soldiers and their families. It's still extant right now. The Buffalo Soldiers, we know that they even came to Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. They were usually under the command, when they went into Mexico and captured Pancho Villa, they were with General Pershing. That's how he got his nickname Blackjack. Here we're looking at some of the census records, and occasionally you'll find some that you can really read and they're clear. Many of them are going to look like this or even worse. When you order your census forms or you download them, look at the columns to see what information is pertinent to your research. One thing that was very helpful to me was, I believe on the 1910 census, they asked a woman, how many children have you had? How many children are still living? This can help you account for some that you may not be able to find. There are different questions. In 1920, one of the questions was, do you own a radio? And you would think, well, why would they want to know that on the census? Radio was new, but think about it. If our government wants to get in touch with us now, they flash a news bulletin on TV, and the whole country knows it in a matter of seconds. They wanted to know if you had a radio for that same reason. So other copies of census records. Now, some of them ask, can you read? Can you write? Do you own your own home? What type of work do you do? Some of the census records will ask the name of your mother and father and the place that your mother and father were born in. These records or this information will further your research. I found that my third great-grandmother had listed her place of birth as South Carolina in 1812. And the slave owner, I followed his migration from South Carolina into Alabama. And that's how she got there. Because sometimes you want to know that too. Well, gee, if he's in Texas, but he says he was born in Tennessee. Very often you can follow the route of the slave-owning family. As the Indians were pushed farther and farther west, the land was given out to the planters and the farmers. So they moved farther and farther west. The Freedmen's Bureau, as I said, set up banks, schools, and they also performed marriages for the freedmen. Many of the former Confederate states issued a proclamation to legitimize the common law marriages of former slaves, and they required them to come in, swear an affidavit stating that they had cohabitated under old slave law and wished to continue to do so. There was not a marriage license or a certificate given out, but usually these affidavits are filed with the marriage records. And the marriage records up until the 1960s were usually filed under colored. Now that could be in a separate ledger, or it could be in the very back of the regular ledger books. This is on a county courthouse level. This is the affidavit for my great-grandparents, and it says, "This day Richard Brooks and Amanda Brooks, free persons of color, appeared before me in my office and stated that they had lived together as husband and wife for the period of 23 years, which would have been from 1858. They did this in 1881, and that they wished to continue to live together as husband and wife." When I originally tried to get a copy of a marriage license, I was told it didn't exist. There was nothing there. When I went to the courthouse in Kentucky and talked to the clerk, and she says, "Well, wait a minute, let me see." And this is what she found. This is a marriage certificate for my grandparents. And what you can get from these marriage certificates, both of them are named. It gives their ages. Says he was 20 and she was 17. Family tradition is that she was about 13, and some said he was still wearing his hair in braids. It shows where they were married, who the witnesses were. This is one from Alabama. This shows my great-grandmother on my father's side. She was married at 13. There's a mystery here in that it said that I, Haywood Kidd, give consent for my daughter Minnie to marry. On her death certificate, it said that her father's name was Nelson Culp. So I don't know which way to look for her. And I've never been able to determine who her mother was. This is my brick wall right now. More marriage licenses, and you see the different forms vary. Some states and counties required that a bond be posted, some didn't. After the death of my great-great-grandfather, his widow, she applied for her widow's pension. He was a Civil War veteran. And on here, she talks about when he enrolled, the date he enrolled, what his company was. He was in the 6th Cavalry, where they went and made their declaration, and the minor child is still at home, was my grandfather. Most southern states did not record vital records until about 1912. Often the birth, marriage, or death of slaves would be recorded in plantation journals or in their actual day-to-day work orders. What they would do at the beginning of the spring season, they would distribute tools or shoes or warm blankets in the winter. And this was usually done in family groups. And they kept a record of it, especially of the tools, because they could be used as weapons too. This is an early birth record from Henderson County, Kentucky. And on here, this was my great-great-grandmother's sister. She's Amelia. She was born in 1852. And over where it would normally say parents, it says Elijah Arnett, owner. She was born enslaved. Death records. This is a death certificate for my great-great-grandfather from 1919. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage. I think that's a stroke. You want to keep up, if you can, with the death certificates, the death records. Does your family have high incidence of stroke or diabetes or any congenital or genetic disease that can be passed down? This is the thing that they're doing with 23andMe and the other DNA sites. They're giving you a genetic health profile. This is the certificate of death for my great-great-grandmother, the one that I said Haywood Kidd gave his consent for his daughter to marry, and yet her brother said that her father was Nelson Culp. It also says that she's buried at the Bridge Cemetery in Lamar County. That's our family cemetery. We've always called it the Wells Family Cemetery. Had no idea that it was called the Bridge Cemetery. I've been trying to research that to see. I know who they bought the property from because the people themselves, a white family, they're buried there in our family cemetery. Land records. You can find land records on a city, a county, or a state level. Did your ancestor own property? If he did, he paid taxes on it. It would be listed at the county clerk's office. Homestead land warrants can be found at this site. This is the Bureau of Land Management. What was done as the land was being taken away from the Indians and more settlers were heading west, land that belonged to the government was issued out. It was sold. Maybe some of you have seen where the people were racing in Oklahoma to stake their claims to the land. In most cases, you just applied. You can go right here and check it out. See if your ancestor was given homestead land, especially those researching in Oklahoma and some of the well-known homestead states. This is my great-great-granddad's warrant for his land, and he got this in 1899, I believe. This is county map from Lamar County, Alabama. You can also get this on the county level. Right over there, it's Rising Star Baptist Church. That's a church, and at one time it was a black school that my great-great-grandfather gave the land for the church and the school. He had 13 kids, so he needed a school. Over through here is the Wells Family Cemetery, and most of the land in between belongs to the family. This wonderful piece of paper, it's an affidavit of descent. When someone dies without a will in a state and they leave property, in this particular instance, my grandfather was trying to get clear title to the property. In order for him to do that, every living descendant of his mother was listed on this document. It was almost a complete family tree. It's called Affidavit of Descent. School records can be useful. This is a letter that was written, I believe, in 1974 from my aunt to a school district in Mississippi. And what she was trying to do was get her Social Security benefits started. And she said, I'm seeking information about the age through school record of Marjorie Reese. And she tells him the school was located about 5 miles east of Water Valley, Mississippi, in Oak Grove, which is a town that no longer exists. And she said she attended from 1919 to 1923. One of the teachers was Jim Buford, who was a cousin. And she says, I'm trying to get this information for Social Security reasons. And here's the response. State of Mississippi, County of Yalobusha. Marjorie Reese, female, is in the list of educable school children of Yalobusha County, Mississippi for the year 1920 as being 10 years old. And it also stated that she was brought to school, I believe, by her father, William T. Reese. So now we know she was born in 1910, and she did attend school there. African Americans in military records. We have fought in every war this country has ever engaged in, beginning with Peter Salem and Crispus Attucks at Bunker Hill, the Battle of Chalmette, or what they call the Battle of New Orleans, with Andrew Jackson. Was the army for our side was mostly composed of freed slaves, Creoles, Native Americans. 180,000 African Americans fought in the Civil War. About a third of them were killed. World War II, World War I, all the way through. Most military records can be obtained through the National Archives, but World War I draft registrations were mandatory. Every man between the ages of 17 and I believe 35 was required to register. So we have these records, and the registration cards for African Americans, they clip the corners on them to identify them, which makes it a little bit easier for us now. I'm not sure about their motivation then. Blacks who sided with the British during the Revolutionary War, about 6,000 of them left with the British and went to Canada, into Halifax, Nova Scotia, and started all black communities. St. Catharines is a pretty famous one. I think that's where Harriet Tubman eventually settled, in Canada. Whoops. Here are the sites. If you want to see if your ancestor was a Civil War soldier, and these are fun too because it tells you their units and what battles they fought in. When the unit was, they don't say disassembled, but when they break up an army unit, disbanded, discharged. Oops. Well, we won't fool with that right now. We'll go to World War I. And it's at FamilySearch.org. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. World War II records can be obtained through the National Archives. Everybody gotten these written down? Okay. Whoops. When I scroll up on it, I lose the bottom part. It goes too far up. It takes me to the next slide. This is enlistment paper for my great-granddad. And it says, the personal description of Richard Brooks, Company D, 6th United States Cavalry, is as follows. Born in Hopkins County, Kentucky, age 28, a farmer, black complexion, hair and eyes. I think that's black. And his height was 5'4". So he wasn't any taller than I am. This is his grave, and he has the military issue gravestone. And this is what you'll find when you go to the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors website. It has him listed. And the area that I've covered up with the picture of the tombstone, that's his regimental information. And it tells where they fought and under whose command. My nieces and nephews, when they were little, they had heard the story. One of the great-grandfathers had fought in the Battle of Milligan's Bend, which is a very well-known battle. It was the first time freed slaves ever fought against their former owners. And it was a horrendous battle. They came in, about 2,000 Texas regulars, on a camp of about 700 former slaves who had only been in the military a matter of weeks. Some of them had just come in. And it was all hand-to-hand, vicious battle. Reports of people being stuck to the ground with bayonets. Men laying dead side by side with each other's bayonets stuck in them. My nieces and nephews, they would tell this story, and they'd throw in a few karate chops. I love to hear them talk about this. Once again, this is one of his applications for his pension. And the genealogical information on here, he says that he was married to Amanda Brooks, née Arnett, that they lived in Henderson, and he lists his children that were still at home. Jenny, born 1862, George, 1867, Neil, 1873, right on down the line to my granddad again. This is some for the other great-grandfather. And this one is really good because they asked him where had he lived since the war. And he says he was in Shelbyville, Kentucky from 1866 to 1888, then New Albany, Indiana. And he goes on, and he eventually ends up in the old soldiers' home or the veterans' home in Dayton, Ohio. But every place that he listed, I found him on the census for that location. To really be a good genealogist, you have to want to be a detective too. And you have to read between the lines, and you have to say, well, now, if this was so, then they should have been there. So if you're nosy and you like to investigate things, you'll really enjoy this. This is my grandfather's World War I draft registration. Richard Brooks, he was not a junior. His dad was Richard Sr., the one that was in the Civil War. And he gives his address, his date of birth, says he was naturally born an American. His occupation was a painter. This is the man that he worked for, where he lived, his wife, and his children. So there's a lot of information on here. And this is dated June 5th, 1917. It says his medium height, he was stout, had gray eyes, black hair. Once again, I encourage you to look for books on the area that you're researching. Very often, someone has compiled a local history book. It may even just be the ones where you write your own history, you give it to the book publishing company, they publish the book and then sell it back to you. This particular book This is a history of Lamar County, Alabama to 1900, I believe was the title. Towns of the county, and the area that my family lived in was called Moscow Community. And it lists, and right there is D.U. Hollis, who was a slave owner of my third great-grandmother. And it talks about him coming from South Carolina, which, bingo, she said she was born in South Carolina in 1812. Now I need to know when they migrated into Alabama. This was fun. But Buck Jackson Road got its name from Madison Lee Buck Jackson. In the early 20s, before there were road commissioners, there were overseers for certain roads, and it was the duty of everyone living on that road to either work to keep it open or to pay someone to do the work for them. The names that are underlined are all my relatives that lived along that road. This is the chapter of the book of Lamar County history that dealt with African Americans, titled Whitecaps and Black History. And right down here is one of the mentions of my great-great-granddad, Doug Wells. And it said, Peter Shaw was one of several black men who managed to attain financial assets during the post-war years. And they list others, and Doug Wells, who sold lumber. And I think he had a contract with the train station to sell them lumber, and he supplied something else to the city of Vernon. This is my paternal side, and my father's family was from Water Valley, Mississippi. Actually, the little town was called Springdale, which no longer exists, but in the cemetery they have a memorial plaque. And freed blacks and descendant members of the Hawkins, Pearson, Reese, Shipp, and Steen families are buried here. In Calhoun County, which is like across the road, they established Mount Pleasant Church, Bryant School, a cotton gin. They had an all-black town at that particular time. My maiden name is Reese, and my great-great-grandmother was a Steen, but she spelled hers S-T-E-I-N. There are different spellings on it. This is a newspaper article, and this is my great-great-grandfather on my dad's side, one of his sons. And I just thought this was funny. Last Thursday afternoon at the home of Asa Fleming's, colored, near town, occurred a wedding which was far above the average colored wedding. Asa's daughter, Marie, and Tom Wells were made man and wife by Esquire J.S. Guyton, who 18 years ago married Asa and his wife. The ceremony was performed in the yard before a large crowd of both black and white, after which a bounteous dinner was served, separate tables being set for whites and blacks. This is from 1897. This is from newspaper articles from 1898. My great-great-grandfather was killed. And this is an account. One Negro kills another. Doug Wells, a Negro who lived about 3 miles from this place, was killed yesterday evening. And they talk about how the man called him out to his gate. There was some type of an altercation, and the man stabbed him. And the family, Wells's relatives, have put out a reward of $50 for the arrest of the man. I checked. At that time, $50 in 1898 was the equivalent of $1,130 today. They wanted him caught. Marion Bankhead, colored, who killed Doug Wells on the evening of the 6th, was put in jail here Monday. And he gives his account of what happened. And then he places a $500 bond and is never heard from again. And I'm told that very often this is the way the judges and the police officers would acquire black people's land. I'm sure he didn't have $500, but I was told that the family put up their land and they moved to Detroit and never came back to Alabama. This is a newspaper account, or actually it's a copy of the obituary of my great-grandmother. And what I did, I asked my mom, I said, what's the name of the newspaper down there? She told me. I called. And I said I wanted a copy of an obituary from 1933. And they said, oh, you need to speak to someone in the archives. And within a day or two, he sent me back this. And it says, many people in Henderson, both colored and white, were sorry to learn of the death of Amanda Brooks, colored, who passed away at 4 a.m. Tuesday. And it goes on to say her age and that she had been a young woman in her 20s at the time of the Civil War, and that she was freed by the Civil War. The fact that she was a midwife and how she had gone out through storms to deliver babies, and that she ruled her family with an iron hand, and she left 105 descendants. Just one phone call got all of that. Like I said, as we're looking for individuals who are chattel property, we're looking for wills, deeds, bill of sales, ads for runaway slaves, and auctions, plantation records, old family Bibles, and these are the slave owners. Sometimes they will list the slave in their family Bible. As a rule, if a slave was of advanced age, over 100, or if they had done something meritorious, if they had saved someone's life, they would be mentioned. Church records may mention the baptism of slaves or a broom jumping, and those were popular. This is a will of Berryman Hollis, who was the father of the man that owned my great-great-great-grandmother. And in looking for wills and deeds, you want the inventory of the will, because the inventory is going to list the property, which will include the slaves. So if you order a will, make sure you tell them you want the inventory. Yes, can I answer a question? You want to know what state this will was recorded in? This was in South Carolina. This was before the... Church and cemetery records. This is Rising Star Baptist Church. As I said, my great-great-grandfather provided the land for the church, and at that time the Rising Star School. And if you follow it down, all the underlined names, all relatives. I think they made a mistake and they said that the church had been there since 1799, but I'm thinking they had that a little wrong, because I don't think Alabama became a state until the 1830s. Like I said, genealogical societies and historical societies, you want to contact them. This is a cemetery that I believe I have relatives buried in. The great-grandmother, who I can't determine who her dad is, his family was buried in this cemetery. They go out, they record the tombstones, they do GPS locations, because a lot of these cemeteries are back off in the woods now. Some of them, nobody, somebody just stumbled, oh, look, there's tombstones. The genealogical and the historical societies are your best friend on that. Gleanings from family memorabilia. We're back to that stuff in that shoe box and that hat box that your grandmother had, or all those papers in the trunk. That's my father's brother on the left. This man is a cousin on the right. Another cousin gave me this 20 years, well, as you can see, this gentleman died in 1966. She gave that to me in the 90s. And she was in her 90s at the time, and she couldn't remember. This is the letter that this man's son wrote to her, and he said, I know that you and I have never met, and I'm guessing that we are related in some way. I am Clarence Reese, Jr. The reason I'm writing this letter is a few days ago, while going through some mail, I ran across a partial letter that you had written to my father. Then, by looking at the postmark and noting the letter was mailed sometime this month, I realized that you must not have heard that my father had passed on September 10th, 1986. I have been trying to locate, and you notice they spell their Reese R-E-E-C-E. We spell ours R-E-E-S-E. I've been trying to locate this family ever since she gave me this letter. No luck so far. Another wonderful piece of family memorabilia. This is a brown bag pedigree chart that was made in 1941 when my cousin Elliot was born. His dad made it and gave it to him, and it had been locked up for all these years. And about 6 years ago, Elliot found it. The people that are listed, I have accounted for most of them. The mother, where it says Suvelle Murray Lee, I have an old church record from Corydon, Kentucky from 1878. My great-great-grandmother, Amanda Arnett Brooks, Suvelle Murray, and Thula Murray were all church members of this church at that time. I found that at rootsweb.com. More family memorabilia, things that will help you if you run across them. This Western Union telegram from 1936 was coming from my father's older sister to a brother, telling him that one of their brothers was dead. He had been killed in an accident in New York. James is dead. Come home at once. Lavelle. So at least I know in 1936, Aunt Lavelle was in Water Valley, Mississippi. Uncle Ernest was in Omaha, Nebraska. This little card up here, that's Uncle Ernest's gas rationing card from the war years. He was driving, if you will notice, a Pierce Arrow. Join email lists. Get your names on those lists. Through this list, I met Chandler Hollis. He not only lived in the small town I was researching my family in, but was from the white slaveholding branch. He shared a great deal of information with me, made my search easier. Since his death, his sister and I have become friends and continue to share data. When I go to Mississippi now, I stay with Kay. And then we run the 14 miles across the line to Alabama to the courthouse. And here's his letter. The Haywood kid, same guy that signed on the marriage license. The Haywood kid that you mentioned in the 1870 census is shown in the household of David William Hollis, who is my great-great-grandfather. There was also a Robert Hollis listed there. I've never found any records showing where Daniel Williams owned slaves. There were 3 Daniel William Hollises about the same age living within 15 miles of each other. So my great-great-granddad had his name legally changed to Red Daniel Hollis. I don't know why the red. My great-great-grandfather was Brunson Hollis, and I found no records for him owning slaves. However, his oldest son, Hubert D., did own slaves. He says he'll look through his paper notes and see what he can come up with. In my search for an abandoned cemetery, he found some relatives of mine, and he's telling me about them. Judging by the info emailed to me, I think probably Harriet was a slave of Daniel Upright Hollis. He owned a large plantation in the Turkey Creek area, which is exactly where my family is and owns land at. This man was so instrumental in furthering my research. I really, really mourn him. He died. Legal transactions, naming your ancestors. We're back to the wills, the deeds, the mortgages, that thing. Friend in Kentucky, someone I met on a mailing list. I got to the courthouse today and did a little research. You might want to print this out. And it's the inventory and appraisal of the estate of William Brooks from 1846. And right there is my great-great-grandfather, Richard Brooks, as a little boy, and that's his brother Fox, or Foxall. An additional inventory in 1851 mentions the hiring out of some of the slaves. And the widow, in her dowry, she received Hannah, Henry, and Fox. So the brothers were separated. Colonel Brooks died in 1847. His son, Philip Thomas, was a minor. Philip's older brother, Daniel, was named his guardian. And right down here, this is from the will book entry, Hopkins County. It is unclear exactly where the two slaves were residing, whether in Hopkins or Union County. And he goes on. The slaves mentioned there were Delphia, about 38, and her children, and Richard, about 2 years, my great-great-granddad. So this is where it's so important to know who that last slave owner was. I found out that there are still some Brookses living in this area and that there is a Brooks cemetery there. That cemetery may be where my great-great-grandfather's parents are buried. And this is that same document, but this is the original from the courthouse record. The Freedmen's Bureau, we talked about them. The Southern Claims Commission, a lot of entries there. Farmers who said they lost property because of the war, or I've actually seen where some actually wanted to be reimbursed for the price of their slaves. It also has who was stationed where. Very often there'll be some labor contracts. After the war, slaves who had formerly been working in the rice plantations, the Delta was opening up. They needed cotton pickers. So the Freedmen's Bureau would make contracts with the planter that he would guarantee to pay such wages and provide cabins or whatever, and they would actually transport the slaves to work in those places. There are records of these. This is a rare photograph. It's a picture of a United States colored troop soldier and his family. And I love the little girls' dresses and hats. This is from a Freedman's bank account. These records have a great deal of information. Here you see his name is Morris Collins. The date of his application, 1871. He was born in Cedar Hill, South Carolina, brought up in the same place, the residence of Mr. Ball. If any of you have read the book Slaves in the Family, The Balls owned approximately 20 plantations in South Carolina. And Edward Ball wrote the book Slaves in the Family. And through his writing of the book and sharing the records, this is how we located Priscilla, who was a slave girl who was captured in Sierra Leone, put on the slave ship Hare, which was captained by a man named Godfrey, taken to South Carolina, sold to the slave house of Lawrence and Austin, and Lawrence was related to Ball. Elias Ball bought her in 1756. She married. She worked on approximately 5 of the plantations. She had 13 children. She died in 1813, I believe. From those 13 children in the family group list, he was able to find her 7th great-granddaughter. And this was the girl, Tomlin, that I went to Africa with. Because the officials in Africa, in Sierra Leone, they wanted to see someone who had been a descendant of a slave taken from there. When I was there, one of the people there told me that seeing American blacks, it was like seeing ghosts, because they thought we had all frozen or that the British had eaten us. And nothing about slavery was included in their school curriculums until our trip there in 2005. If you look further down, you'll see it gives a brief description of him. It tells his age at that date, his complexion, his occupation is farming on a rice plantation. He works for John Ball, his wife's name, his one child. And look at this. His father was Morris, his mother was Molly. He lists his brothers and his sisters. From this, we were able to go and find this same family group on the 1870 census and trace this family down to their descendants today who participated at a big event that we had in Magnolia Plantation in Charleston. African and Native American research. African and Native Americans mixed and mingled from their first encounters. Native Americans in the early years were enslaved along with African slaves, and they became runaways. They were called cimarrons. This is what the Spanish called them. That's their term for a runaway. It became corrupted into what we know as Seminole. In the early years, you had black Seminoles and red Seminoles. The black Seminoles knew how to cultivate and plant. The red Seminoles knew how to hunt and fish and live in the woods. They got together, fought off the United States Army for many, many years, and have never signed a peace treaty. Some Native American tribes did own slaves, and they did fight for the South. The Cherokees, Seminoles, Creeks. Actually, the last battle of the Civil War was fought in Oklahoma by a Cherokee group. When the South lost the war, those tribes that had sided with the South as part of the surrender and the treaty, they had to give up more of their lands in Oklahoma. They had to free their slaves and give their slaves tribal benefit rights. So if you hear someone say, well, he's a Seminole freedman, he was a descendant of a slave of the Seminole tribe. He may or may not have Seminole blood. Some of the pure Africans were war leaders under the Seminoles. Chief Billy Bowlegs, for one, who's the great-grandfather of a good friend of mine. He fought right along with Micanopy and other Seminole leaders, possibly with Osceola himself. The story is that Chief Osceola's mother was an African woman, and periodically slave raiders would come into the villages, gather up people, take them and sell them. And supposedly this is what brought on the last Seminole War. Yes. The question was, did the Choctaw originate in Mississippi? Yes. The 5 civilized tribes, and they were called civilized because they had taken on white man's ways as far as farming, living in houses, communities, having barns, owning slaves. The 5 tribes were the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, and there's one more. Choctaw, Chickasaw. And yes, these tribes, they did originate on the East Coast. The Cherokees were all through Georgia and Tennessee. The Choctaw were predominantly in Alabama and Mississippi. And of course, the Seminoles were in Florida. As they were pushed farther west or taken to Indian Territory, a big staging area was in Fort Smith, Arkansas. They took them, you've heard about the Trail of Tears, that they made this long march, and so many of them died because of the weather and because of hunger and because they were given blankets that had been infected with yellow fever. It was kind of a planned genocide.
I didn't know my great-grandfather. Yes.
Okay. If you go to this website, Afrogenius, they will give you the connection for all of the tribal information that you need. Now, when they were transporting the Native Americans east, I think Jackson had said that by 1830, they were all supposed to be west of the Mississippi River. They took census counts of the Indians that they took on these treks to Oklahoma and to Arkansas. You have the Dawes rolls, the Guion-Miller rolls, different census rolls that are available to you online. Like I said, use Google. Anything you can think of that you want to find, put it in Google and hit search. You're bound to come up with something. Look for genealogy societies. Look for genealogy records by state. And look for conferences and for workshops and for presentations such as this. Genealogy is a simple mixture. 1 part love of family, 1 part love of history, and 2 parts determination. And I hope you've enjoyed this.